Evelyn Underhill, 1875 to 1941. The first thing to say about Evelyn Underhill is that she's a woman, because she could, of course, with that name, English name, be a man. And given the time that she lived, many people were actually surprised that what she did and what she wrote was, in fact, the work of a woman. There's a lovely story that comes to us. She had been speaking during a gathering of the Fellowship of St. Alban and St. Sergius, which is a coming together of Anglicans and Eastern Orthodox in Britain. And when she'd spoken there, a renowned theologian, Bulgakov, apparently went up to the secretary and said, "Whoever is that little woman? She knows too much." Says something about the time, doesn't it? But something about Evelyn Underhill. She did indeed know a lot. She lived in many ways a very remarkable life. She was the first woman in England to give a lecture series at Oxford University. She was elected a Fellow of King's College. She was awarded a Doctor of Divinity at Aberdeen University. She wrote 39 books, more than 350 articles, translations, reviews, and broadcasts. And Archbishop Michael Ramsey, the Archbishop of the Church of England, said that it was Evelyn who had done more than anyone else to keep the life of prayer alive in the Church of England between the wars. So those are very high accolades, and I could give you more. But she was not an academic. She didn't belong to the university. She wasn't a lecturer or a professor. She wasn't a priest in the church. She wasn't a religious sister. She was a Church of England laywoman. You could say that's all. She was born in Kensington, in West London. She lived there pretty much the whole of her life. She married the boy next door, and they continued to live in Kensington. He was a barrister, and they lived a typical upper middle class life of London in those times. So in some senses, there was nothing special about her. She liked being on the borders of things, though. She liked not being in the middle of academia, not being in the middle of the institutional church. It gave her the sort of freedom that she wouldn't have had in those other locuses of life, to follow her passions in the way that she felt called to, without feeling overly constrained by the demands of institutional life. Her reputation was extremely high as a retreat leader and as a spiritual director, and you can read some of her letters of direction, and many of her books were composed of addresses that she gave at many retreats. She was particularly associated with Pleshey Retreat House in Essex, where she's still remembered. But the most enduring part of her legacy, I think, is a book that she wrote in 1911, a book called Mysticism. And it was a bestseller. It was almost an instant bestseller and remained hugely well read for the whole of the first half of the 20th century, and has continued to be a classic on the subject of mysticism. What was her passion? What drove her to write that book? It wasn't an academic passion as such, although it was a work with a great deal of scholarship and a huge amount of reading and thinking underlying it. Her passion really was to bring back the life of religious experience to the church and to people, to help them to understand that God was real and was a transforming power, and that we can, as human beings, ordinary human beings, really have contact with that. And so she wanted to sweep away some misconceptions about mysticism. She wanted to tease out what it was and what it wasn't, to deal with a lot of the confusion that there was around. And she wanted to inspire people. And that's exactly what the book did, hence its great popularity. The reading behind it is vast. It runs to 500 pages. Almost every page, particularly in the second part, is brimming, overflowing with quotations from many, many mystics in the Western tradition. She, in small appendices, she includes 87 of the great mystical figures with full bibliographies, and she creates a nice little historical survey with no less than 128 names in it. So clearly what she was doing in her study every day, day after day, was this vast work of reading, thinking, and indeed translating, because many of the texts were not available in English at that time in the way that they are now. So a great deal of what she's quoting are translations that she made herself. So this book, Mysticism, the subtitle is A Study in the Nature and Development of Man's Spiritual Consciousness. A study in the nature and development of man's spiritual consciousness. So she's already in that subtitle spelling out what she thinks mysticism is. It's something that as human beings we can undertake. It's something that can happen in us, to us, and through us. It changes our consciousness. It's a very engaged sort of thing. She divides the book into two parts. Part one is called The Mystic Fact, and part two, The Mystic Way. In The Mystic Fact, she's really trying to clear the ground for her subject, and she offers this definition. Mysticism is one of the most abused words in the English language. It has been used in different and often mutually exclusive senses by religion, poetry, and philosophy. It's been claimed as an excuse for every kind of occultism, for dilute transcendentalism, vapid symbolism, religious or aesthetic sentimentality, and bad metaphysics. On the other hand, it has been freely employed as a term of contempt by those who have criticised these things. It is much to be hoped that it may be restored sooner or later to its old meaning as the science or art of the spiritual life. So she offers a simple definition, the science or art of the spiritual life. She offers other definitions in other places, but that's not a bad one, I think, for her at any rate. Her way of thinking about it is that throughout human history there have been people, not necessarily many people, but that there have been people who have somehow known that there was more to life than what can be gleaned at the end of our senses. That there's a whole other dimension to life, which has gone under many names: the absolute, one, God, reality, truth. And that people who have set out on a search for that reality, for that otherness, for that oneness, although they've done it at different times and in different places and as different personalities, that you can see a commonality of method and experience amongst them all, which makes, for Evelyn, a body of evidence that can be presented. So we're talking about something that really can be analysed and defined and presented. It isn't just wishy-washy and misty. There's real evidence that can be drawn together, and that's what she wants to do. The next thing she wants to do is to sort out what it isn't and how it relates to other things that are associated with it. So she wants to say, first of all, that mysticism is not an idea, It's not an opinion. It's not a point of view. It's not something you can learn about. It's not something you can look up in the back of a book. It's not a pursuit of knowledge, but it's a lived process of transformation. And she wants to say something similar about science. It isn't something you know about. It's something you live. It's something you are. And it's about love. It's not about knowing about things. I think this quote, when she's talking about philosophy, gives you a good idea of the charm, I think, of her writing. She's talking here about a philosophical trend called idealism that was current in her time. Perhaps the most sublime theory of being which has ever been constructed by the human intellect is stultified by the exclusive intellectualism of its own methods, by its fatal trust in the squirrel work of the industrious brain, instead of the piercing vision of the desirous heart. When we ask the idealist how we are to attain communion with the reality he describes to us as certainly there, his system suddenly breaks down and discloses itself as a diagram of the heavens, not a ladder to the stars. It interests man, but does not involve him in its process. It does not catch him up to the new and more real life which it describes. Hence, the thing that matters, the living thing, has somehow escaped it. And its observations bear the same relation to reality as the art of the anatomist does to the mystery of birth. So I hope you can catch there the sort of distinction that she wants to make. This big distinction between what we can know about, what the brain can work out, its squirrel work, and the way in which we can be pierced by the vision of the heavens, which has to pierce the heart. It has to be lived, it has to be fully engaged to be worth anything at all. She talks about theology, about art, about magic, about psychology, and how mysticism relates to those things. And then she comes up with a summary in 4 marks of mysticism for her. First mark, she says, is that true mysticism is active and practical, and I think you've got the sense of that already. It's something you have to do and something that has to happen. It's not theoretical. It's an organic life process, she says, as something which the whole self does, not just about the intellect or opinions or views. It has to engage the whole person. She says then, its aims are wholly transcendental and spiritual. And she means wholly in a real way. She says it's nothing to do with adding to life or exploring things or rearranging them or improving them. So it's nothing to do with adding a bit of spirituality to your life or getting a better work-life balance or getting into some creativity. It's not to do with improving anything or getting it better. It's got to do with this move into a completely different dimension that then begins to change you. Sets the heart on the changeless one with a capital O. And then the third mark is that this is an encounter with a living and personal object of love. And fourthly, it's a definite state or form of enhanced life. So you know if it's real, if it really does begin to change your life, your whole life. So the mystic fact, summed up in those 4 marks of mysticism. And then she turns to the mystic way. Remember, her subtitle, A Study in the Nature and Development of Man's Spiritual Consciousness. And that idea that if you look at the mystics through the centuries, the methods that they've used and what they describe as their experience, then you can pull from that a recognizable process of transformation that goes on. And that's what she tries to do in the second half. She acknowledges that what she's doing is difficult because the range of mystics through the centuries, living in different times and in different places and different personalities, and the spirit working in them in different ways, creates a very great range of experience. But she still wants to try and draw out a norm. I'm not personally convinced that she necessarily achieves her goal, but it's a jolly good stab, and I think it's a helpful one in many ways. Here we go. So she describes 5 stages of the mystic way. She wants to say, of course, it isn't really a straight line. These things don't really happen one thing after another. They tend to weave around between each other. But with that said, she then attempts to create this scheme. So the first thing she says is there has to be some sort of an awakening. There has to be a point when something penetrates you in a sudden, unexpected way that makes you realize that there is another reality other than the one that you've been familiar with so far. And she says that that is usually sudden and direct and is often accompanied by visions or other extraordinary experiences. And it's usually accompanied by intense feelings of joy and exaltation. So a really encouraging start where something breaks in on you, which gives you exalted feelings. So much so that you want to follow it up. You have a taste of something that you really like and you know you want to go for. And then along comes, with that sort of experience, comes a sense that in comparison with that, you're, in my words, a bit of a mess. There's a lot of cleaning up to be done. And that cleaning up process, that clarifying process, she calls purgation. And it's a very necessary part, and often a very painful part of our experience. But as a result of that, the third stage is put into place, which is illumination. That clearing out of some of the dross of our life makes it possible for light to begin to flow in. So our life takes on a different feel. It feels clearer. We see better. We find joy. There may be visions and adventures of the soul, she says, thinking about St. Teresa and some of the other mystical writers. So in a sense, the rewards of purgation are very clear. There's a sense of the divine presence and probably a sense of happiness. All which encourage us to keep on this journey, even though it takes us through difficult places. And she says for many people, that's as far as it goes. But for others, that desire keeps them going even further, into the stage of the dark night of the soul, or the divine absence, which is where we learn to love God for God's sake, not for the rewards and the gifts that come to us. And if we proceed through that, then we come to the ultimate goal, the 5th stage, which is union. So a clear scheme which she lays out there. Evelyn had her own awakening, of course. There was a sort of gradual stage of it, through philosophy, study of philosophy, through enchantment with art, particularly the religious art of Italy, through ritual and symbols. She belonged to the Hermetic Society of the Golden Dawn. And eventually she comes to a retreat in a French Franciscan convent. And after that retreat, she says this: "The day after, I came away, a good deal shaken, but unconvinced. I was converted quite suddenly, once and for all, by an overpowering vision which had no specific Christian element, but yet convinced me that the Catholic religion was true. It was so tightly bound up with Catholicism that I had no doubt that the church was my ultimate home." And her own awakening, interesting enough, is very much reflected in the way mysticism is written. Mysticism is not an obviously Christian book. She talks much more of God or the absolute or the one and of the Spirit than she does of Christ. And the focus is much more on what happens in the human being than it is on God. But as her own life progressed under good direction, she moved to a position in herself which was much more Christocentric, which was much more incarnational, which was much more connected with the church, in which she began to really know for herself the intimate love of Christ for her and for others, and to understand and to be really drawn up into the sacramental life of the church. And she came to feel that a vague and unfocused sort of spirituality was not really adequate for us as human beings to bring us to where we could potentially be brought. And it's very interesting to note that her last great book, written in 1936, towards the end of her life, was on the subject of worship. And we'll finish with a quote from that book. "Not man's needs and wishes, but God's presence and incitement first evoke it. As it rises toward purity and leaves egoistic piety behind, he becomes more and more the only fact of existence, the one reality. And the very meaning of creation is seen to be an act of worship, a devoted proclamation of the splendor, the wonder, and the beauty of God. In this great sanctus, all things justify their being and have their place. God alone matters. God alone is. Creation only matters because of him. Wherein does your prayer consist?" said St. John of the Cross to one of his penitents. She replied, "In considering the beauty of God and in rejoicing that he has such beauty."